I've been doing something wrong for the past 5 years while recording guitar that was such a basic mistake, I almost couldn't believe I was messing it up. And you want to know what that is? What? If you're confused like I was when I found this out, then let me explain. Okay, so I'll start off by explaining how I started off doing this wrong, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I figured out I was actually doing it wrong, and then I'll end the video talking about what you're supposed to do and why that's the correct thing to do. So about 5 years ago in 2018, I bought my first audio interface, which was a Focusrite Scarlett 2i2, which is a super popular interface. And like a lot of other aspiring prog rock, prog metal guitarists, I ended up stumbling back then on Misha Mansour's video where he talks about how he records guitars with the exact same interface, which I think is how I stumbled on that video. And in that video, he says something which I heard back then, and for the next 5 years, I just continued to do when recording guitars without giving it a second thought. And what he said was this.
There is clipping going on there, and it'll just get worse as you do it. So, to get an ideal signal to noise ratio, you want to get it right to the point where it just kind of starts going into the green there.
When you first hear this, it kind of makes sense because, you know, who doesn't want a strong signal and to maximize the signal to noise ratio? But there's a key detail in the video that I missed, and that's that he's not plugging his guitar directly into the interface. Instead, he's plugging it into an Axe-Fx, which is an amp modeling unit, and he takes two outputs, a left and a right for stereo, out of that and plugs those into the two inputs on his interface. So for his particular setup, the advice he was giving in the video is actually correct. But my mistake was, well, one, not listening and realizing that he plugged into an Axe-Fx and not the interface. But also two, not realizing that the same advice doesn't work when you do plug directly into the interface. Okay, but how did I actually realize that I've been doing this wrong? You know, up until now, I've kind of been talking in retrospect, since now I obviously know I've been doing it wrong, but how did I realize in the first place? The realization hit me when I watched a video that Rabia Masad put out not too long ago. Honestly, that video completely blindsided me. I remember the video had like a pretty vague title, and I clicked into it not really knowing what it was going to be about. And then in the video, he talks about how he's confused about why people are complaining that his plugin that he made with Neural DSP is sounding bad. And, you know, he talks about how like, oh, he thinks the plugin sounds fine, obviously. But then he finds out that people are actually increasing the input gain on their interfaces. And then he said this.
And again, just to demonstrate, if I turn up the DI signal, tons more gain, and the same thing happens if I turn up the input of the plugin. Because what that's doing is it's sending a higher, hotter signal into the amp model, so the amp is reacting as you would expect it to if you were sending more signal into an actual amplifier. So hopefully that little rudimentary demonstration has helped you work out that you don't need to turn up your DI signal.
I remember watching the video and hearing this and thinking to myself like, yeah, like that's cool, but like, I don't know, it must be like something he does or something. Like, I don't need to do that. I actually almost left the video at that point because I was so sure like, oh, I have nothing to learn from this video. But I started to read the comments on the video, and after reading a few of them, that's when the disbelief started to set in. And I kind of just figured like, okay, look, it takes 2 seconds to try this out. I should just try setting the interface gain to 0 and see what happens. But yeah, then I actually set my interface gain to 0 and it just sounded like 10 times better. Fuck! Yeah, I mean, pretty much every single preset I had sounded clearer. It sounded crisper. The just definition of the tone was crazy in comparison to what I had before. And then I went back to how I used to do it with a lot higher of an input gain, and it just sounded like a muddy mess. And it's kind of honestly felt like I had been living my entire life with my ears super plugged and someone had just unplugged them for me, and now I could hear clearly. Okay, but one thing I will say that did make me feel a bit better when I found this out is that this actually seemed to be a common misconception, and a lot of other people were making this mistake too. So what's going on here? Why does Misha's advice apply for his setup, but not when you plug your guitar in directly to your interface? Well, to answer that question, we have to talk about instrument inputs versus line inputs. So broadly speaking, there are three types of musical equipment signals. There are microphone signals, line signals, and guitar or instrument signals. Microphone signals are the weakest of the three, followed by a guitar signal, or a DI as it's sometimes called, which is a super, I guess, variable signal. It can be very loud, but also very quiet, so it's super dynamic. And line signals are the strongest of the three. So one of the things that an audio interface does is that it will raise the level of microphone and instrument signals up to line level so that the signals are essentially as strong as possible. Most audio interfaces, at least as far as I know, kind of set reasonable defaults for you out of the box, depending on the type of input you set, and also depending on the type of cable you're using. So is it a TRS or a guitar cable, or is it an XLR or microphone cable? So what the interface is actually changing for each type of input is the impedance. For Focusrite interfaces specifically, when you plug in an XLR cable into an input, it will automatically set that input to the impedance that's needed for a microphone, kind of by default. So if you set the input to be a line input and plug in your microphone, you can adjust the gain accordingly, and it'll be in a good sort of range for most microphones. But here's where it gets kind of different for instrument inputs and guitars specifically. For instrument inputs, I believe this is true for most interfaces, when you set your input to be an instrument input, the interface will set the impedance to be the same impedance that a guitar amplifier would have. So even when your gain is set to 0, that's kind of the same as plugging into an amp directly when you're plugging your guitar directly into the interface. And so when you boost the signal by increasing the gain on that input, it's kind of like you're using a boost pedal in front of an amp, but it's a boost pedal that doesn't shape the tone at all and just amplifies the signal. And if you think about it, that's not really what a real amp is designed to work with. And so this wouldn't sound great on a real amp, and it wouldn't sound great on software plugins either. So essentially, your interface with the gain set to 0 on an input and it being an instrument input is the closest thing you can get to plugging into an actual amplifier when using software plugins. One thing I will add though is that there are a lot of different audio interfaces and also a lot of different amp plugins. While the advice I said should apply in most cases, there are variations in plugins and interfaces. You know, for example, plugins might expect different input levels to operate at an optimal level. And there's also just going to be differences in specs for audio interfaces as well. There's actually a really useful resource for this, and it's a spreadsheet that was made by Sebastian Sampson. And he made a video covering the same topic. And in that spreadsheet, you can look up the audio interface that you use as well as the plugin that you have. And with your interface gain set to 0, the spreadsheet will tell you what you should set the input gain to in your plugin to get the best results. So it can be really handy, and that kind of addresses the sort of variances in audio interfaces and plugins. So it's a super handy resource, and I'll leave the link down below. Okay, and lastly, to end this video off, I'm just gonna do a quick comparison between what my tones sounded like before I made this fix and what they sounded like after I made this fix. And hopefully you'll see that I wasn't overreacting too much. Or maybe I was a little bit. Okay, so I'll start off with a guitar that has humbuckers in it, and this is a set of bare knuckle polymath pickups. And I'll just start off with the default setting on the Archetype Nolly plugin. And the interface gain right now is set to just before clipping, which is the way I used to set it before figuring out how to do it properly. So here's what it sounds like. And here's what it sounds like with the same preset and the input gain set to 0 on my interface. Okay, so same guitar and same plugin, but I switched to the second amp in the archetype nollie plugin, which is slightly lower gain. So here's what that sounds like. Okay, so again, the same guitar and same plugin, but a clean tone this time. Okay, so I'll do all the same comparisons again, but this time I've got my Strat with single coil pickups, so you can hear the difference in how that sounds as well. So I'll start again with the default setting on the archetype nollie, and here's what that sounds like. And here's amp 2 again. All right, and lastly, here's the clean amp again. So here it's especially noticeable, the difference between the higher input gain and the 0 input gain, since when it's not set to 0, the amp is almost like distorting a little bit. So I think the difference here is especially noticeable. So let's see what that sounds like. All right, and that's a wrap for this video. Let me know in the comments down below if you could tell the difference in the comparisons that I was doing, and give this a shot on your own home setup as well, and see if you can tell the difference there too. But yeah, thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.